So exciting news this week is that my mum has bought me 2 lengths of 1940s fabric. The lovely prints in the crepe chiffon fabric, so very delicate, tricky to sew perhaps because my vintage machines do like really tiny light stitching, which is wonderful for holding garments together, but less wonderful if you have to unpick them. And actually this chiffon crepe wouldn't survive being unpicked. You would just literally rip a line across the fabric, so I'm going to have to be very careful. So I'm going to show you the fabric, and then I'm also going to bring out some of my 40s dress patterns and choose one of the fabrics and one of the dress patterns to make up this week. So this is the first fabric, and as you can see it's a delicate chiffon crepe with a lovely design of white snowdrops on a blue and green background. And the second fabric is also chiffon crepe with this lovely wavy design with flowers that face in each direction, so you can use it up or down. So just looking at my dress patterns, or anyway some of them, I'm quite interested in this one. It's a 30s pattern, and the collar and the cuffs are picked out in white, which I think could look really fetching with my white snowdrop pattern, because that collar and cuffs just kind of pick out the pattern of the fabric. And I'm just going to have a quick look at the pattern to see if it has any suggested fabrics. Not all vintage patterns do suggest fabrics, but this one does helpfully, and it looks like my chiffon crepe will be perfect for it. So I'm looking with interest at this pattern, which is such a pretty shape with those tulip sleeves and hip folds and like a bow at the neck, and I think it could look really lovely made up in this fabric. I'm just having a quick look to see if there are any suggested fabrics in the pattern, and it doesn't look like there are anywhere. And then this pattern, which is pretty, I'm not sure though, and then this one's lovely, but I think the buttons will be too heavy on the fabric that I've got, which is so delicate. So I think I've narrowed it down to these two, and it's just a question of which one I make up first. So I think I'm going to start with this pattern because the colours of this fabric are so perfect for late summer. And then I'll use this fabric with the design on the right later on. So while I was laying out the pattern on the fabric, I realised I didn't have quite enough for all the details. So I'm going to piece together a belt with a nice vintage buckle. I'm going to keep the tulip sleeves obviously. I've cut strips of bias binding, but I am going to only have one hip fold. I'm going to keep a nice bow for the front of the dress. So these are the pieces of the skirt. There are 6 panels in all, a centre front and centre back, and then a skirt side front and side back, which are sewn together with an opening allowed on the left side for fastening. And there are waist darts in the front and back on each side. And along the seam that I'm pointing out between the front and back panels and the side pieces is where the hip flaps will be stitched. They're just caught into those seams between the centre and the side pieces. Of course, in my case there's only going to be one flap on each side. And then just showing you how it will work with just being caught into the seam there. And this is how the flaps are made. The end is turned under and slip stitched. And then the skirt has an opening on the left. The pattern matching's gone quite well, if I say so myself. and just those French seams, because it really frays this fabric, beautiful as it is. And then the seams with the waist darts as well, curving at the waist area. And the bodice also has darts at the waist. And the bodice has an interesting construction. The front just says avoid seam, which is, I guess, a way of saying place on fold. And then it has this little kind of keyhole shape which you cut into the bodice after cutting out the main shape. So I just drew the line I need to cut along with tailor's chalk. And then you make bias binding to go around all those raw edges. Just see here, and then that centre bit is gathered and you create a little fold to go over the centre, and that is where the fastening goes. And that is the bodice with the bias binding stitched into place. And now we start on the sleeves, and I'm just pointing out the tailor's tacks on the front sleeve, and then you match those tailor's tacks on the front with the back sleeve that folds over the front sleeve. And the raw edges are hemmed carefully in position, and then you stitch the underarm seams. Then you gather just the top of the back sleeve and pull the gathers up so that it fits the front sleeve before you stitch that sleeve into the armhole opening on the bodice. And it has a dart at the top just to create that extended shape, those lovely tulip-shaped sleeves. So I've set in the sleeves to see that the shoulders need shoulder pads, and on the pattern it just says happily insert ready-made shoulder pads. Well, no ready-made shoulder pads today are going to work very well for a vintage dress. So I'm going to try making those little triangular shoulder pads you see in vintage dresses, just so you can see each side. There's that dart on the top of the sleeve, and then the bias binding stitched in place, and the gathers pulled up just on that small front section with the fabric folds over the top where the hooks and eyes are going to be positioned. That's just so that you can open it up to get your head through. And these are the hip flaps in position, and the bodice attached to the skirt, and the sleeves attached into the armholes. And to just hide that fastening, there is a bow, and that's just stitched on. And then finally just the belt. If you're wondering why I tend to always be a little bit bent over when I'm up here in the loft, it's because the only place you can stand upright, if I stand upright, you can see I'm like and it's so easy, I do it all the time, to just lean back and thwack my head. I'm so relieved that I have managed to do it without having to unpick. The pressure has really been on not to make any mistakes, and as I've been sewing to a deadline, I've had like a low level anxiety all week that I am going to make a mistake. So it's with absolutely massive relief that I've reached the end of the machine stitching, and touch wood, I think absolutely nothing's gone wrong. The sleeves were quite a mental challenge, I have to admit. The vintage pattern is typical of vintage patterns in that it's not even true. Like, I used to think, oh, it's true that they just assume some knowledge, so some obvious things are left out. But no, I actually think they're not terribly well written and edited some of the time, because they will go into some really nice detail on some aspects of the garment, but then absolutely leave out other construction points. And I don't think the construction points they leave out are necessarily the obvious ones. So I have a feeling, much as I love vintage patterns, that modern patterns might be a bit more carefully written and edited. So this vintage pattern has been no exception, with some aspects very clearly explained and diagrams showing you just what to do, and other aspects just kind of hopped over. And here I am wearing the dress. I'm so thrilled with it. I actually think it is the prettiest dress that I've ever made. That's the little bow at the neckline, and my belt and the little hip flaps, and I'm wearing it with a little 1930s hat which I've had for ages and didn't go with anything, and suddenly it's perfect for this dress. And there are my tulip sleeves that couldn't be puffier. And this vintage fabric just drapes beautifully, and the print is so wonderfully 40s vintage. And here comes my friend. She nearly got left out of this video. She couldn't possibly allow that. She did get a kiss on the nose. I mean, here she is supervising my pirouette. Border collies are supposed to be really good at taking orders, but in my household the roles have reversed, and I'm just showing off my genuine 30s silver shoes. Dog's giving them a bit of an inspection, not too impressed. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.